Chapter 8, Securing the Republic, is going to finish up our look at period 3 and the debates that are ongoing regarding construction of this new nation, how it should be run, by what ideals it should be function, etc., as well as begin our look at period 4, particularly with the administration of Thomas Jefferson and the kind of change that that represents from the early national period and how those ideals are going to carry over for much of the rest of the first half of the 1800s. So question one is, what issues made the politics of the 1790s so divisive? At the very top of that list should be Alexander Hamilton's financial plan. Hamilton was the first Secretary of the Treasury under President Washington, and the AP exam focuses on four elements of his financial plan. First was to pay off the national debt from the war, as well as assuming state debts to the federal government. Secondly, they would create a Bank of the United States, which was designed to hold on to public funds, issue currency, and make loans. Third, the plan would place a tax on distilled alcohol, particularly whiskey, in order to raise revenue. And finally, it would establish tariffs to generate money that would be used as subsidies to fund the development of early industry and manufacturing in the United States. This plan was divisive because it was opposed by so-called strict constructionists. One example, or the most prominent example, would be Thomas Jefferson. Strict constructionists like Jefferson had noted that the Constitution didn't explicitly, in so many words, give the government the ability to do things like establish a national bank that was found in Hamilton's financial plan. Now, Hamilton, on the other hand, loose constructionist. He cited the necessary and proper clause of the Constitution to expand government power. And simply put, the necessary and proper clause of the Constitution allows for Congress to give itself implied powers to carry out those powers that are explicitly expressed by the Constitution. Here's the example. The expressed power in the Constitution is that the federal government may regulate interstate trade and commerce. Hamilton, using the necessary and proper clause, is arguing that it is necessary and proper to create a national bank in order to regulate interstate trade and commerce. So that is a loose, kind of flexible interpretation of the Constitution, which runs afoul of Jefferson's strict constructionism. Southerners, where Jefferson and strict constructionism drew most support, agreed to the plan ultimately in exchange for the creation of the nation's capital, Washington, D.C., in the South. A second issue that was very divisive was the French Revolution. So political divisions deepened with the French Revolution, especially after France and Britain went to war. Jeffersonians, or those who supported Jefferson, supported the French despite the chaos that was the Great Terror. Hamiltonians, or those that supported Hamilton, on the other hand, supported the British because they were afraid of the anarchy that the terror represented. Now, no one advocated getting directly involved in the war, but Washington made sure that we wouldn't by issuing a proclamation of neutrality in 1793. And this seemed to run very much afoul of our military alliance we had with the French during the American Revolution. That said, we have plenty of reason to be angry with the British. In particular, the British practice of impressment angered a lot of Americans who saw it as a violation of their sovereignty. Impressment meant that the British were seizing American sailors and forcing them to work on British vessels. Now, impressment is supposed to only operate to, forcing or pressing British subject into service in the British Navy. So by pressing Americans into service in the British Navy, they are essentially still claiming sovereignty or rule over the Americans. We tried to negotiate this with the British, but the product is something called Jay's Treaty. It did not end the practice of impressment, but what it did do was get the British to agree to abandon their western forts, which they were already supposed to have done with the Treaty of Paris that ended the revolution. And in exchange, the United States guaranteed a favored status to British imports, making them our #1 trade partner. Um, Many Jeffersonians and Warhawks, they see this as aligning the United States with Britain by effectively canceling the American-French alliance that had been present during the American Revolution. So what we end up with is the formation, really, of our first political party out of the group that was calling themselves the Hamiltonians and the group that was calling themselves the Jeffersonians. Federalists, who were supporters of the Washington administration, also supported Hamilton's financial plan. They supported the British as opposed to the French in their conflict. They supported rule by an educated elite, and they drew most of their support among wealthy merchants, farmers, lawyers, etc., particularly in the North. And the Federalist view of expansive federal power is going to be illustrated by their use of force to crush the Whiskey Rebellion, wherein Pennsylvania farmers had revolted against Hamilton's whiskey tax, which had been part of his financial plan. Now, notably, under the Constitution, the national government now has the power to establish public order, which they had not had under the Articles of Confederation, which had allowed for something like Shays' Rebellion to happen. So they take this more expansive view of federal power, and they will use it to great effect, at least in the case of crushing the Whiskey Rebellion. Now, their opposition are Democratic Republicans. I think the textbook refers to them as Republicans, and while that's not exactly incorrect, it's unnecessarily confusing because the Republican Party that we have today is actually a party that's not going to form until the 1850s. So this is not the same party. In fact, the Democratic Republicans are the ancestors of the modern day Democratic Party. Anyway, Democratic Republicans are supporters of Jefferson. They supported the French rather than the British. They had more faith in democratic self-government rather than rule by an elite, and they tended to draw most of their support among Southerners and Western farmers. Now, there's more public political debate than ever, which helps in the formation of these two early political parties, and that's aided by a booming press and growing literacy rates, which were already higher than their equivalents in, say, Britain or Europe more generally. Question number two, how did competing views of freedom and global events promote the political divisions of the 1790s? So, President George Washington, our first president, served 2 terms and then, despite his likely ability to be elected to a third, voluntarily stepped down. And this establishes an informal precedent or standard of a 2-term presidency. He was trying to avoid the creation of a de facto monarchy wherein a popular president could be elected over and over and over and over again and could serve for a long period of time. In Washington's farewell address, which becomes kind of a tradition for presidents, is he warned against the dangers of faction. Specifically, he's warning against these emerging political parties like the Democratic Republicans and the Federalists. He also doubled down on his proclamation of neutrality from years earlier by warning against entangling alliances with other nations. His successor, the second president of the United States, is John Adams, who had been Washington's vice president. He was elected in 1796. Voting in this election broke down along sectional or regional as well as party lines, as you can see from the map here, where the North overwhelmingly went for John Adams, whereas Southern states overwhelmingly went for Jefferson. Adams will serve 1 term. And in that term, Adams is facing a continued conflict between France and Britain, where their navies are trying to prevent any U.S. ships from trading with the other. So they're both embargoing one another, which is threatening our ability to trade with both nations. Now, when we try to negotiate with the French to drop their embargo, American diplomats are met by three officials, which earned the names X, Y, and Z, who demanded a bribe to open negotiations. This so-called XYZ affair became public and it poisoned our relationship with France. And we're going to engage in a kind of undeclared war called the quasi-war until Adams manages to negotiate a peace in 1800. Controversially, during Adams' administration, he signs into law the Alien and Sedition Acts in 1798. These laws were intended to silence criticism of the Federalists, which Adams of Congress belong. These laws made it more difficult to become a citizen and essentially illegal to criticize the ruling government or the Federalists. In opposition to this, Jefferson, Madison, and other Democratic Republicans respond with the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions in 1798. These criticize the Alien and Sedition Acts as being unconstitutional and suggest a really important idea that is going to stick with us for a long time, despite not really having much constitutional or legal basis. And this is the doctrine of nullification. So importantly, the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions in 1798 promote the doctrine of nullification, which claims that a state can invalidate or effectively ignore a federal law if it deemed it to be unconstitutional. This is going to be a really important idea for later at several points during American history, but it's important to note that this idea is bunk. There's really no good constitutional basis for this whatsoever. The Supremacy Clause of the Constitution alone refutes the very idea that state initiatives can override or invalidate federal law. Nonetheless, it's a persistent idea, and in this context, one that is used to challenge the actions of the federalist run federal government. Adams will lose his reelection bid in 1800, and Jefferson, who is his rival, and will Jefferson win the White House, but Democratic Republicans are going to make significant gains in state and local government elections as well as congressional elections. And this is referred to as the Revolution of 1800 because it's an enormous sweeping change as we hand control from one political party to the other. But it's also revolutionary because the incumbent party, or the party that was already in power, the Federalists, voluntarily gave up power peacefully after losing this election. There was no civil war. There was no attempt to hold on to power despite the election. And while this is something we take very much for granted today, it was indeed revolutionary at the time, and it helps to prove that the American experiment of representative democracy can work because even if your side loses, you accept that loss, give up power, and simply wait until you have another chance in the next election. Now, this election of 1800 and the election and administration of Thomas Jefferson technically is the beginning of grade 4. Again, we can expect some overlap here, but I've not so subtly here altered the color of the slides so you know that we have entered a new era. Anyway, so question 3 is, what were the achievements and failures of Jefferson's presidency? So Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans made it their work to reduce the size and authority of the national government, and this reflects their belief in strict constructionism and a smaller, less powerful federal government. They will reduce the number of federal employees, they will reduce the size of the Army and Navy, and they will eliminate all taxes, including the tax on whiskey as part of Hamilton's financial plans, except for the tariff. So this dramatically reduces the size of the federal government, which was part of their ideology and their plan. That said, Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans' ideology is, really kind of swimming against the current here. because they have to go up against another branch of government, the Supreme Court, the judiciary branch, which under Chief Justice John Marshall is making rulings to help establish the supremacy and far-reaching power of a strong federal government. Many of the decisions tend to strengthen the power of the federal government rather than reduce its power, as the Democratic Republicans have been attempting to do. One good example is the case Madison, which established the principle of review, which says that the federal courts can rule something to be unconstitutional, as in, not keeping within the framework of the Constitution, and in doing so, render it null and void. Something else running contrary to the Democratic Republican ideas of smaller government is the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, which was actually done by Thomas Jefferson. So this violated his strict constructionist views because the Constitution does not allow him to do what he does here. So we had been allowed since Pygmies Treaty in 1795 to trade through French New Orleans. So our Western farmers were able to send their goods south down the Mississippi and then trade it through the French city of New Orleans. But Jefferson sends, during his administration, envoys to offer to purchase the city. And they are surprised to find that the French are willing to offer up all of the Louisiana territory that you see here on the map. Jefferson does not pass up this opportunity. He purchases the Louisiana territory for $15 million, which is a steal, and it peacefully doubles the size of the United States overnight. And although this does violate his strict constructionist views, Jefferson had hoped to promote an agrarian republic where most Americans were small, egalitarian, local farmers who were very participatory in their democracy. Jefferson believed that the yeoman or small individualistic farmer best exemplified virtue and independence. So Jefferson will make this purchase despite it being a violation of his strict constructionist views, and famously, he will dispatch Lewis and Clark's Corps of Discovery to explore and begin to map the region. Another important action of Jefferson's presidency is the Embargo Act of 1807, and this will have the effect of devastating the American economy. So war had resumed between Britain and France, who were once again blockading one another, which is a problem for us. So we embargo both nations, meaning that we are going to enter into effectively another kind of boycott or non-importation movement, much like we had used against the British in the lead up to the Revolution. So it was meant to end violations of what neutral U.S. trade, things like impressment and so on, through using a boycott, which again had been so successful during the Revolution. But in this case, it doesn't work. And even worse, it was opposed by many New England merchants, which makes it not very popular precisely in the part of the country that's supposed to be engaging in it. Jefferson will serve 2 terms. Our next president will be James Madison, and he's going to be confronted with calls for war with Britain from Western war hawks. The idea was to try to uphold the principle of free trade against violation by British impressment practices. And these war hawks were also calling for the United States, Canada, and Florida, especially Florida, because it tended to serve as a refuge for runaway slaves. You'll remember the Stono Rebellion. Keep in mind that many Democratic Republicans draw support from the West and the South. That's where these war hawks are coming from. So, of course, they want to annex Florida because they tend to be slave owners who don't want their slaves to be able to get refuge there. So this brings us to the War of 1812. And question 4, what were the causes and significant results of the War of 1812? So one cause is a deterioration of relations with Western Native American tribes in our efforts to move them further west. Some tribes, such as the Cherokee, pursued a policy of assimilation in white society. Others fought back. So Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa, for example, urged resistance to Western white settlers. Again, we have this pattern where Tecumseh leads a political and military resistance, and Tenskwatawa leads a kind of cultural or religious resistance that urges pan-Native American unity, a purging of white ways, and so on. And the reason that this becomes a cause of the War of 1812 is because these Western tribes that are attacking white settlers are aided by the British. So in all, the causes of the War of 1812, at least on our end, is first of all, British impressment of American sailors, and more generally, their interference in commerce, which we see as a violation of our neutrality and our sovereignty as an independent nation. Again, we also have the desire to annex Canada and Florida. And finally, in the final cause here of the war is British aid to Native Americans like Tecumseh. Uh, the War of 1812 is perhaps one of the least consequential wars in American history. The Treaty of Ghent, that war after fighting, essentially just restored the status quo after both sides tire of fighting. Um, the results of the war is not any new territory or anything like that. They're less tangible things. So, for one, an outcome, a significant effect of the war for the United States is that it intensified nationalist feelings. There was this sense that we had kind of won a second war of independence. After all, we had survived the burning of the Capitol. We had survived the near complete loss of the Northwest Territory, which was overrun by Native Americans and the British. This is the war in which we write our national anthem, the Star Spangled Banner, which was written during the Battle of Fort McHenry. Um, so there is a feeling that we won the war, although that is debatable because neither side really won or lost, I would say, but that was not the feeling. Another outcome is that it advanced the career of a general named Andrew Jackson, who won a major battle or a major victory at the Battle of New Orleans, which just so happened to actually come after the end of the war. News travels slowly in this period. To say the least, Andrew Jackson will be pretty important coming up. Importantly, the war also promoted industrialization because during the war and even before, as far back as the Embargo Act in 1807 with Jefferson, we weren't trading with the French, which meant we had to come up with our own industries to manufacture goods because we weren't able to import them from our old trading partners. Finally, in a political sense, the war contributed to the demise of the Federalist Party. Um, at the Hartford Convention in 1814, the Federalist Party had issued official opposition to the war, and they floated the doctrine of nullification that they did not have to conform to federal laws relating to the war because they saw it as unconstitutional. So now you have both the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans arguing nullification. And again, even though this idea doesn't really have much of a constitutional basis at all, it's becoming a persistent idea in American thought and a potent one at that as it's adopted by both sides. Um, the Hartford Convention firmly situates the Federalists as anti-war, and that does not play well once the war is over with, and most Americans perceive us as having won this very important war. So it leads to charges that the Federalist Party was unpatriotic. They lose support and will effectively become a non-entity in the American political scene. Thus, the United States enters the so-called era of good feelings. It's a short period of time in our history where the United States effectively only has one political party, the Democratic Republicans, and therefore we have some widespread agreement on what national goals and national policy should be. And we'll begin to look at the effects of that in the next chapter as we more fully enter period 4 and see how the War of 1812, despite being kind of inconsequential, serves as a good mile marker for the development of the American nation state.